Things Hidden. And so this is David Gornoski. We're continuing the Things Hidden podcast. And today we're talking about something I jump around in history, different pieces, all with anthropology, with ethics, with the ethics and anthropology of the gospel narratives in mind, understanding how Christianity has shaped our world, how Jesus's personhood revolution, which is what I call his actual project for the world, to change the world in a political, ethical, aesthetic, cultural, the whole 9 yards. It all goes in holistically together. That personhood revolution has a lot of effects. And so I'm kind of doing a detective story on a large scale, right? The question we have in our current times is, why do we have injustice? Why do the elites and the rich seem to get more than the others? And why is it that we can't cure the diseases and things that bother us, or the pollution and degradation of our ecology that we see or perceive around us? Why do these things feel so unjust, right? And so we're always looking for answers. And the reason why we have a unique concern for victims, concern for the least of these in the West, is because of the influence of the Christian narrative in our culture, in our times. And for 2,000 years, it's been a slow infection, right? Because it's not an ideology. It doesn't convert you fully understanding all of its implications when you encounter this story. But humans are fundamentally story-driven creatures. And this story drives us to do very, very interesting and unique things. The West is unique in that in order to gain social status in the Western societies, you must identify yourself as a ally of certain victim groups or victim classes, and then attack recent ancestors and their time periods in history and show how they have been oppressors and how they have destroyed the opportunities and freedoms for many people and their descendants today. And that's okay, right? There's some truth in all of these things, but these stories are shaped in our culture by the influence of Christianity, by the influence of when we read the story of Jesus's life and we hear art and we see art and we hear of role models that are in history, and we learn, we receive this full body of knowledge from the West, influenced at the foundation deeply by the story of Jesus and other things, but that infection of Jesus' story is the elephant in the room of our Western times, our modern culture. Then it has certain implications, right? The ancient world did not have a story that said the first shall be last and many who are the last shall be first. It did not have a story that concerned itself with the leper, with the sick, with the misfit, as having divine blessing in their being, even in their affliction. They did not have this. This was a unique tradition from the Hebrew prophets down into the climax of that narrative with Jesus's life, fully embodying this personhood revolution, calling people out of collectivism, calling people out of hive mind mentality, mental prisons of defeat that are perpetuated by collective violence. He destroys all of that in his story. And as that story spreads, those people who encounter it start to slowly deconstruct their own violent, hidden practices that they don't, when they first encounter this story, they don't fully understand all the ways it's going to uproot their traditions and institutions. But over time, as these things percolate like a yeast working itself in a loaf, it creates a whole new world. And that's exactly the world that you and I are inhabiting right now. So it's fraught with danger, it's fraught with risk. But I want to hone in on something about texts of persecution. And I want to hone in, again, give you some insight as to how we have what we call political correctness or concern for victims. The more radical version of this that's emerging, they call it social justice, or intersectional theory, which I studied a little bit in years past and am familiar with it. They call it in a more common word. They call it woke, right? It's like a more casual term for this whole thing, woke ideology or woke, and so all of this is having quite a selling effect on millions of young people in the West, and it seems to be catching on contagiously, mimetically, transmitting person to person very fast and rapidly because we're hungry for justice, and we think that this narrative seems to scratch our itch for justice for victims, for assuaging our guilt for the fact that we realize that we're victimizing people in many different ways. But we can't agree on who we're victimizing as a society, and we can't agree on who the real oppressors are. That's where the fight is. And part of the reason why we can't is because no myth binds us together after the story of Jesus' life starts to using the form and fashion of myth, but in a mirror way, which unveils the ugliness and the fake lies behind mythology. Wherever we go now, that story destroys our myths that we still hold on to even to this day. And they don't, and a myth operates in its power by being able to bind a community together to say, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. And these are the rules, these are the taboos, and we all agree on this game together. And the myth is the story that binds all of that together, that we tell each other to reinforce the rules, to reinforce who's the good guys and who are the bad guys. And Jesus destroys that mythic framework slowly as societies engage it. Obviously, the church does violent things, as we'll get into today. But that's because they have a proclivity to hold on to mythic bad ideas about the story of Jesus that again, because we're all infected with mythic proclivities that justify our violence and our insider cliques over others. Those things are harder, those scapegoats that we keep are harder for us to see by their nature, because to have a scapegoat is to not know you have one. You don't realize that the person you're persecuting or blaming for all of your problems or shaming as the big villain of our time really isn't as different as you would like to think they are, that they're actually indicative of something more like a mirror about who you esteem and who you hold up as a role model or a figure or an icon or a leader or an ideology that you subscribe to that also has its own hidden victims. So the people who bother us the most politically and socially and culturally as role models oftentimes bother us the most because they remind us of the thing that we ourselves are struggling to exorcise out of our own hearts, out of our own temptations to use violence and government coercion to stop or punish. So why is it, this is the question for today's episode, why is it that the West has this unique political correctness, victim concern that you just don't see to the same degree in all other cultures? It's because of our Christian and Hebrew prophetic tradition that we've all been shaped by. But how does it operate? So I want you to, and this is just going to be a preview, we can unpack this in other episodes too, but I just want you to see a sketch here. So imagine that stories, that you can look at stories, what humans write down about how things work and the history and the events of their time. And you can look at the way they look, how they read, how they transmit information, whether it's realistic or symbolic, how it interprets certain events. You can read it almost in the same way that people talk about, a fossil record showing intermediary steps of some kind of creature that's evolving in its shape and form through the years. So you can see the fossil record of human culture by looking at how texts, how stories of collective events look through the different ages. And then if we look at that, we'll be able to see how the story of Jesus and the Gospels, when they spread, they start to affect how we write stories a certain way. So the reason why we have political correctness is that we are so, the gospel has made our news transmission much, much more realistic. We still hide behind groupthink. We still hide behind, a kind of herd mentality in the way we interpret data that justifies our position and our heroes and, cliques. But it's still way more grittily realistic. When you turn on the news today, you don't hear about, you don't read mythic language like the God of America has flown up into the air and battled the God of Russia and threw him in a fireball into the sea. And out of that, defeat created a new order of peace that would be established by a young God who would watch over where this God was defeated. You don't read headlines in the Associated Press that have that kind of symbolic language, right? That was the ancient world. That's how they interpreted the ecstatic emotional events of a scapegoat murder, a scapegoat killing from their primordial past. And they interpret it in a way that takes the violence out of their hands and projects it into the sky as gods doing these violent, sacrificial kind of patterns to each other to avoid chaos and to save the community from falling into a state of chaotic violence and loss of unique identity between the people who lose themselves in the madness. And so that's why all mythology, again, I said the creation myths, they tend to start in chaos, and then a god kills another god, or a god defeats someone, and out of that defeat, that crushing sacrifice, order is made, and the earth is made out of that person's body or something. In different stories, you have that. So when we get to more recent time, when we look at texts of persecution, like in the medieval ages or in the 1600s and on, or Salem witch trials, we still see vestiges of the scapegoat mechanism process. So what we call a witch hunt today is just a more modernized version of the scapegoat mechanism at the roots of all human culture that mythology conceals through symbol and projection to disembodied things called gods, which are themselves stand-ins for actual victims of sacrifice at the earliest stages of these things being depicted as a god, as something beyond human. So when you look at these texts of persecution and you see more recent times where we were burning witches here and we were doing these things there, or we did the Inquisition for heresies, or we burned people at the stake, why, so the question, what I'm trying to get at is, when you read those texts, you see that they're written in a way more grittily realistic fashion. We can still have the ability, because of Christianity's influence in our time. We're higher along that fossil record of text, right? Our media is a little bit higher on the trajectory there, so we're able to read our ancestors' texts and see where it says, oh, this group caused the plague, and then they were poisoning the river, so we had to wipe them all out, and when we did, the plague was averted. We know when we read that text to be skeptical of the author. We know, okay, there's bias here, right? But when we read an ancient text like 4,000 years ago, it's so coded in mythological language that we don't even know where to look, right? Because it hasn't been infected with Christianity, making the text more honest, even when it's still lying, right? When we go to mythology prior to Christianity deconstructing the way that we tell the stories of our scapegoat violence, the violence is so concealed by this disembodied symbolic language of gods that we just say, oh, they're just being creative and fanciful, even though they're all doing ritual human sacrifice alongside these myths. We don't seem to connect those two and say, oh, well, maybe that's the ritual sacrifice is the remembrance of the original scapegoat violence, that these myths are actually distillations and cultural transmissions of these original events, right? We don't connect that. We just say, oh, that's just ancient man trying to make sense of things. They're just superstitious. No, they have a very deliberate, similar pattern around the world. But in our more recent past, we're able to look at these texts of the Salem witch trials and say, wait a second, that person wasn't a witch, or wait a second, that woman did not cause the child to die. I don't trust the narrator of this text. And so we say that was unfair, that was unjust. And so we look for a way to scapegoat our ancestors' because we don't want to face the fact that humans all, including ourselves today, are guilty of this bias of wanting to scapegoat people or blame other people for our problems or kick someone else collectively for our benefit or our pleasure or our feeling of satisfaction, for our feeling of belonging to a clique that we feel like we can, have family with or what have you. So we don't want to face the origins of all these cultures. So we want to, so it's like a blame the messenger effect. Because Christianity makes the text more honest in the lie of these bad killings of burning witches or burning heretics, we then come in and read these stories today and we say, okay, that's really bad. But what are the lessons we can learn from that? The lessons that we learn are blame the messenger. Oh, it's patriarchy's fault. It's because men ruled these towns the most in the 1600s or the 1800s or the Salem witch trials or the medieval ages. Men were ruling these things. So therefore it's men. If we can just fix the patriarchy and bring that down, then maybe that would stop. Or we'll say, actually, that's Christianity. Christianity is stupid. It's superstitious. It's bigoted. It's brutal. It's barbaric. It's dumb. And so when John Calvin burns Michael Servetus at the stake for having a different view of the Trinity, that's just the insanity of Christian extremism that needs to be removed from our time. So that's the lesson we learn, right? And that's how we tend to interpret these things, or that's Western imperialism or something, right? But it's precisely the effect of Christianity in our culture that allows us to have this kind of fossil record of evolution of textual awareness and realism, and also textual skepticism that we bring to those more recent texts. So not only is the text more realistic, it's got half mythological language, but it's also got realistic, more realistic depictions. It's not when they blame the Jews for poisoning the river or for causing the Black Plague. It doesn't say they are flying around like monsters and they poison the well. No, it just says these people, right? And so we're able, that's that group. They were an ethnic minority. That's why they were being falsely accused. But then when we go back to Oedipus Rex, and Oedipus Rex is accused of being the cause of the, this is the plague, the problems of Thebes, right? That we don't have any skepticism to the accusation that he himself says he's guilty. I'm guilty of parricide and incest, and I'm the cause of the plague. We just assume, that's just part of mythology. That's just a story. We don't see how that's the same thing as a more realistic, more recent event where people, again, having the wrong idea, the wrong mythic lie in the name of Jesus, burning a man for a heresy. And even in those heresies, they often had to get them to try to admit, confess, and then you would be killed. It's almost like in order to complete the scapegoat mechanism, you need to say sorry and admit your guilt, and then the process is fully actualized. Because then you can say, yes, that we're justified in our fervor against this person. They just admitted that they're the monster we made them out to be. Now we really have to kill them. Incidentally, haven't you seen today in the political correctness ideology of our time that whenever a person is singled out for something they tweeted or something they did in high school or something they said decades ago in private, a bad word, an awful thought, a terrible, association, of the wrong photograph, incidentally, whenever the person apologizes, that's when the mob really goes to destroy him. Isn't that interesting? When Paula Deen came out and said, I'm sorry, I said this awful word in private like 3 decades ago. I'm so sorry. And she's teary-eyed. It was then that they really roasted her and removed a lot of her show deals and so forth. Now she crawled her way back up a little bit, but she never really recovered from that, right? Is when she admitted the confession, I admit it, then they go after. Or scientists who are skilled in something, but they say something, that's politically incorrect about their field. Then they say, I'm sorry. They still lose their job, or they lose their tenure, or they get doxxed or whatever. That just destroys their life. And that's the same pattern we see in the witch trials and things like that. You must confess, and then you're really then you're really complete in the process. Because then the writers of that witch hunt can say in their transmission, and they really believe this, by the way. I'm not saying everybody. Maybe there were some people who knew they were a lie. But the groupthink power is really remarkable in getting us to believe what we want to believe. And so if everybody says this person was a witch and that person said, yeah, I'm a witch, in their pain of being tortured, you say, yeah, she was a witch or he was a witch. And then you write a report, there was a calamity, a child died, this person said she was the witch, we took care of her, we didn't have to deal with that again for a while. And we read that today and we say, oh, the problem is patriarchy, Christianity, whatever, Western capitalism or whatever thing we can justify. But then when Oedipus Rex does the same thing, but it's so symbolically hidden because it has been way before the influence of the Christian and Hebrew tradition in our time, it's so coded in sacrificial mythology that we don't even see it. When Marduk splits someone's head open and out pops a new creation or something, we don't even see, oh, wait a second, maybe that's hidden. Maybe that's things hidden since the foundation of the world, as Jesus talked about, that he's come to reveal. So that's why we have this unique cultural place where we're constantly in the West trying to gain social status by lambasting our recent ancestors' times about the things they did and saying how awful and uniquely awful we are. And that seems to be this way of gaining social status currency while still doing the same sacrificial violence, but this time in the name of a new cause than the ancestors' violence that we lament and their awful bigoted ways. That's why the New York Times, for example, does this 1619 project, which tells great stories about the perspectives of slavery in North America, but they won't talk about the fact that they're cheered on a war in Libya with their politically correct president at the time, Obama and Clinton, to destroy Libya, which killed hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed one of the most prosperous countries in Africa, northern Africa, even though it had severe problems, but it had more wealth than the others around at the time. And it led to the slavery of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people to this day that have now been thrown into this medieval slave trade situation in Libya because of the chaos and infrastructural destruction that we caused. And Obama's partners, like the New York Times, pushed that all the way through. So why will it take 400 years for the New York Times to talk about the evil slavery and the evil war of what we did in Libya? It took them they're good about roasting our ancestors, or not even all of our ancestors, but they're good about roasting the ancestors of the Western Hemisphere, right? And roasting the things they did to the Native American populations and slaves. But they can't critique when it's happening, a wicked, unjust war that kills hundreds of thousands of Africans in Libya today. They have to cheerlead that on in their blindness because they refuse to face scapegoat violence and collective violence for what it really is. So they want to justify it by saying, well, this slavery that we had attacked 400 or whatever years later, that is a product of a unique, racial supremacy, and they want to quarantine it, everything but human nature. As Solzhenitsyn said, the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. It's not something you can quarantine to some other race, to some other gender, to some other ethnic group or tradition or religion or sexual orientation. You cannot quarantine evil as something that is uniquely manifested from other groups. It is unique as something that each human person has to battle, and it is uniquely something that comes out as a really bad thing when we do that as a group and scapegoat and destroy and go to war and bankrupt other countries with sanctions and starve innocent civilians like we do in Libya and Yemen and Syria. All wars, by the way, that again, the politically correct institutions like the New York Times usually cheerlead or do tepid critiques of. So when we're sacrificing people in the present moment, we have a hard time of seeing that because we are still slow to renounce collective violence and fully see our scapegoats for who they are. That Libyans should not have been butchered for Western financial interests or a bad arms deal that went bad or whatever happened with Gaddafi because he was a client of the Western powers at some point that went bad. We're not mafias. We don't act like that, right? We're civilized people. We should be, but we don't see it because we think, oh, it's out of sight. It's out of I'm dealing with my job and my work. I'm dealing with my family. I don't have time to figure out what's going on in Libya, whatever. I like Obama. He smiles. He's nice. He's very charismatic. He's a constitutional professor. We say all these things, right? And then when Trump gets in and he moves 50 soldiers to another part of Syria, oh my goodness, it's the end of the world, right? Because he represents something that is more easier for our politically correct religious ideology to attack. He says, I'm a winner. He's honest about what the state is. He talks about it. Let's take the oil. Let's do these things. He's an amateur at the lie of the myth of the state. He doesn't hide the violence of the state well enough. And so he makes an easy scapegoat to say, oh, he's so awful. Because it's like turning on the light in your favorite movie. I've used this analogy before. It's like turning on the light in your favorite movie and it ruins the suspension of disbelief. I just wanted to see the smiles, the sacred, respectful, dignified language. Notice all the people who are most to harp on Trump being the destruction of dignity and honor in the White House. They all tend to be the ones who are most prone to want to go to perpetual war and perpetual sanctions and perpetual occupation and bases around the world to dominate people by force, to protect our financial and oil and partners around the world, and our arrogance that we are the gods of the world and we can manage the affairs of billions and billions of people with different cultures and different religions and different backyards and different long-term conflicts. We have that same temptation to sacrifice because we don't want to fully wake up, but we are slowly going to get there. We're going to do it the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is just say no to the sacrificial violence of statism, just say no to the lie of envy and coveting that leads to this collective violence at the higher level of our culture, our social behaviors. But that's what I want you to see here. It's because of the influence of Christianity that we're able to have these more realistic depictions of texts of violence in our more recent time, hundreds of years ago, 50 years ago, so forth. And we rightly criticize the violence of our ancestors, but we always want to do it in a way that cleanly protects us from renouncing our use of collective violence, our use of collective violence against the drug user, against the rich person, against the person who uses an energy source that we're scared of or we don't like. We always want to use force to solve real legitimate problems. We always want to use sacrificial, take these people down and take more from this group, and then we'll have free stuff for this person. It's that same sacrificial mechanism, but it's just breaking down more and more, and it's like the cat's out of the bag. You can't go back. You can't restore that unity of myth because Christianity is fully infecting us now. And it wants us to grow up, wants us to become adults and renounce violence, renounce the initiation of violence and the initiation of vengeance. And when we do that, then the whole world is ours to cultivate, to clean, to have clean energy too cheap to meter, to have cures for all these diseases that we want to kill, because we'll be able to be free from the intellectual retardation that happens when we rely on violence and collective force to achieve the problems that we want to solve the problems that we face. That slows our ability to see what we don't know and to look for creative contrarian voices who defy the standard scientific paradigms of certain bodies of knowledge that we think are settled and find solutions right under our noses. But that's what I have for tonight. You can email me, David@aneighborschoice.com. This has been Things Hidden.